Welcome to the Course One podcast. In this podcast, we explore the emerging open financial system. We dive into scalability, interoperability, proof-of-stake, blockchains, and many other parts of this coming financial singularity. Tune in every Monday to dive deep into these cutting-edge projects and protocols with Course One team members and guests. Hi, I'm Brian from Course One, and I'm today here with Greg and Austin from Chainsafe. So Chainsafe has been working for a while. They've been doing protocol development work on a bunch of different projects like Polkadot and now also Cosmos. And there's particularly one project I look forward to discussing with the two of them, but of course we can discuss also Chainsafe a little bit more generally, which is Ethermint. Ethermint was this original project of having the EVM on top of Tendermint, and it was sort of languishing, I think, for quite a while. And now the guys at Chainsafe took it over, and I think have kind of brought it towards production readiness. But maybe let's start with you guys. Do you guys mind introducing yourselves briefly?
Yes, my name is Austin. I work at Chainsafe as a software developer, and I led the development on Ethermint at Chainsafe.
Yeah, I'm Greg. I'm currently the VP of Engineering at Chainsafe, and basically I oversaw a lot of it and just helped with a lot of the kind of nuanced debugging that we'll probably get into a little bit later.
And do you guys mind giving me a little bit of background about Chainsafe? Like, how did Chainsafe get started, and how did you guys end up in the crypto space, and then at Chainsafe in particular?
Yeah, for sure. So Chainsafe is a 27-person team. We're an R&D consulting firm specialized in like blockchain infrastructure. We're mainly based out of Toronto, but we do have a lot of people kind of like around the world. And we started back in say like May, probably earlier than May, in 2017. So we're approaching 3 years this coming year. And kind of we got in the space originally just kind of we were just 5 people just kind of, hacking about. Just random stuff on Ethereum. And then eventually we quickly learned dApps weren't our thing and moved into Web3 infrastructure. And that's what we've been doing ever since. So now, we have our own ETH2 client. We maintain a bunch of the ETH1 nodes for Geth Classic and as well as Besu. We're helping on the Ethereum Classic side of that. Polkadot, as you said, Ethermint for Cosmos, and a handful of other private chains that haven't been announced yet.
Is this sort of evolved by, you guys being interested in working on blockchain stuff? Or like, how do you see Chainsafe evolving in the medium to long term?
Yeah, so a lot of the stuff we started out with was primarily client-based. So it was a lot of consulting. In the time, we've built up a handful of our own independent projects, and we're definitely moving to... We're going to maintain... Chainsafe in the future is going to continue to be like this consulting firm, but we're in the process of doing our own products and our own platforms right now to kind of help streamline a lot of things we do every day. And you'll be able to see something in the near future.
Okay, so some announcements coming there. Okay, cool. And so what about Ethermint? How did you guys working on Ethermint?
Yeah, so we saw that back in, it probably started like in 2017, I want to say. Like it's an older project for sure. And we saw it way back then and we're like, this is cool, right? Because it was kind of like jamming two things that didn't work together. But from what we ended up finding out, the reason it got halted was because doing Ethermint, they realized there's a lot of issues with the Cosmos SDK. So that's why they ended up halting it. And we ran into Ethan Buckman, who is actually from Toronto and lives here. And we ran into him on the street, I think, or at a conference or something. And, we had known him from before. And we were just like, hey, you going to ever do anything with it? And he was like, well, if you guys want to take a stab at it, go. And that's kind of what we did. So that's kind of how we started with running with Ethermint. We were just like, let's bring it to life. It's something that we're like familiar with. We're familiar with Geth. We had some people that played around with Cosmos, not extensively, but, and that's kind of where it went.
I worked at Cosmos right back then, and so I was familiar with the Ethermint thing. And, as an idea, of course, it's very attractive. But it didn't seem to... It just wasn't a priority, I guess, right? Because there was all of those things to do for the Cosmos launch, and then it kind of like languished there for a long time. And there was always some point it will be done. So I'm very happy that like somebody you guys stepped up. And I remember talking also once with Alexei who was also working on Ethermint a little bit, right? And I remember having a conversation with him, and he said that there were some real challenges with actually having the performance of Ethermint, or some speed bottlenecks. So I'm curious, like in building Ethermint, what were the biggest challenges that you ran into?
So I think like the main challenge is just how the two protocols kind of handle the processing of transactions. For example, like the EVM assumes that the whole state transition happens all in one go. So it like checks the nonce, increases it, and then does the state transition. Where Cosmos kind of separates that, where they have this like concept called an anti-handler, where it basically checks the transaction, which processes it to make sure it's valid, and then the state transitions happen at the end of the block. So I just think the discrepancy with that is was kind of a challenge. And then I guess as part of that also, because you can't assume that all the state transitions happen within the EVM module, that there are some discrepancies that have to be accounted for. So just when you're putting it in a system where the EVM module is just one component of a bigger application, it's hard to kind of remain data synchrony, and there does kind of become some bottlenecks with updating state and stuff like that.
Yeah, that's one of the things I did want to dive into a little bit. So, or maybe you can also give a very brief update or a brief introduction to the Cosmos SDK. Like, what is the structure of the Cosmos SDK? And where does kind of the EVM module fit into that?
Right. Okay. So the Cosmos SDK is basically an application framework which allows you to plug and play different modules and basically bootstrap an application without having to build all the components necessary. So Cosmos has built-in modules, like say for example, like the auth module, there's a bunch of different staking modules and basically all the core components that you need to build a blockchain. And then the EVM module is just something on top of that. So basically you can plug and play the EVM module into any existing Cosmos application. And it just basically allows for a different arbitrary state transition function on top of Tendermint. So basically Cosmos SDK handles the application layer stuff on top of Tendermint. And it just basically allows you to configure and modify how the state transition function is defined.
So one thing that maybe some people still remember if they were following Cosmos closely, so there was a sort of a previous concept in Tendermint. I think it had different names at different times, but I think it was called like ABCI or something like that, like Application Blockchain Interface. So there was also the idea that you could build basically directly on Tendermint without the Cosmos SDK. Was that also something you guys explored? What's it like to have the EVM directly built on Tendermint versus built inside the Cosmos SDK?
Right. So I guess the main reason for doing it this way, of building it into Cosmos SDK, and not just as an application that interfaces through Tendermint through the ABCI, is the fact that it allows you to interact with existing Cosmos applications and other modules that are already built out, instead of having a very specific state transition function, which would just be the EVM on top of Tendermint. So it kind of just allows that modularity and allows you to do more things with it if it's built as a Cosmos SDK module, just so that you can extend it, you can build on top of it, you can use it in an existing application. It just provides a lot of flexibility for what you can do with it if it's built with Cosmos SDK.
Okay, very cool. And so you mentioned before a little bit the challenges around having, the EVM, or you have state transitions in the EVM, but then you have also state transitions that happen from other modules. I imagine that must be a pretty tricky thing, right? Because the EVM wasn't sort of built, it was built to be its own self-contained thing, right? And you don't have that situation on Ethereum. And now it's sort of one part. So it almost seems like you have then a sort of interoperability problem that's within the single chain, right? Where you have the EVM interoperate with, let's say, something like a staking module. Can you talk a little bit about, is that a hard problem, or is I guess it's a solvable problem? No?
Yeah. I mean, it definitely is, and I mean the possibilities you can do with it are kind of up to the developer itself. By default, none of the modules are really connected except for the I guess like the auth accounts, like the accounts module. So basically, the only reason that that's connected right now is because to update and like retrieve state for the different accounts, it uses the actual accounts module within Cosmos. But at any point, anyone could create their own module, which implements the keepers, which keepers are basically in the Cosmos ecosystem is basically how you interact with the data, how you either get or set any data relating to a module. And basically those keepers can be included for the EVM keeper or any other keeper to be able to interact with the different modules at any point. So you can create your own module that includes those and you can perform the EVM state transition or interact with any other module within your newly created module. But by default, none of these things are interconnected in any way, except for the EVM module accessing like the Cosmos accounts, if that makes sense. And I can unpack that a little bit more because it's kind of a tricky concept to kind of explain without a lot of background knowledge. So if there's something I can kind of explain a little bit better in that sense, that might be helpful.
Yeah, I mean, maybe we can look at an example. So if you have, right, in Ethereum, and with the EVM, you can do all kinds of cool, DeFi stuff. And now if you have a chain, right, that's built on Ethermint, it will have, its own staking token, presumably. And, this is one of the things that we've been exploring a lot at Course 1 is basically how to bring DeFi to Cosmos. And how can you do like DeFi with staking assets? So I'm wondering, like, how easy would it be to have, for example, like a smart contract in the, that's written in Solidity and of course runs in the EVM module that then, for example, controls the staking asset and, it stakes the coin on that chain. Maybe it votes in governance and stuff like that. Can you do that?
Yeah, like it depends exactly what the flow is that you're talking about. If you're talking about some sort of like precompile so that you can call or interact with one of those modules through a smart contract, that is possible, but it will probably involve forking Ethermint or however you kind of implement it, just so that you can actually change the precompiles that are defined with the EVM, because that isn't really configurable right now. Maybe it might be in the future, but if you want to interact through a smart contract, you could just change the precompiles that are defined, and then that just called the actual interact with the module, which would be defined at the application layer. There is other ways, I guess, that you can interact with both. Is if you create your own module with both of these keepers, you can still interact with both of the state and any sort of state transition that you want to define. Like the main point of, I guess, Cosmos and like Tendermint is that you can define any logic to be your arbitrary state transition function on top of Tendermint. All that logic is handled at the application layer, and you can kind of define it as however you want. And as long as all the nodes in the network will agree on the state transition, then you'll obviously remain in consensus. So it kind of gives you a lot of flexibility to do a lot of different things. It's hard to say exactly how things would work. I mean, it would just be based on your own implementation, but either it could be through some sort of precompile. This isn't something that I've extensively tested. Either that through forking or creating a module that interacts with both of these modules, by default by using their keepers.
One thing I'd love to dive into a little bit. So there was, Project Aragon, of course, very well project that has been kind of, one of the leaders around governance, and their, an Ethereum project originally, built on Ethereum, and then explored building their own chain. And so you guys, can you talk a little bit about the work you guys did with Aragon?
Yeah, so we're still doing work with them. It's actually an ongoing effort. They had an AGP, Aragon grant proposal vote. And they voted to continue the development of the Aragon chain using Ethermint. But what we did for them is they had come to us with a set of questions. And naturally, because of our extensive knowledge of Polkadot and Ethermint, they asked us to just answer, I think it was like 6 questions. So we put that together in a report. We didn't really come to any conclusions. We just, as honestly as we could, answered what was there. And the idea was to contrast between what it would look like for them moving to something like Substrate versus Ethermint. And then they ultimately came to their own conclusion that Ethermint made the most sense for them at that current time and based on their current timeline. So they're looking to essentially not migrate fully. The idea is that they want to be, and I think there's a confusion, they want to be on as many EVM compatible chains as they can, where they can deploy their infrastructure. So they're experimenting to deploy their infrastructure onto Ethermint, with users still being able to interact with it, whether they're on their home chain, whether they're on Ethereum or on Ethermint, they can cross interact, is one of the goals here. And one of the main motives, I guess, for them was issues with their contracts, I guess, because of the upcoming hard fork does break some of their contracts. That was definitely one of them, but not the main motive for doing so.
And so, can you dive in a little bit? Like, what kind of questions did you look at when comparing Polkadot to Ethermint, and what were the, maybe the top 3 reasons why Aragon decided in this instance to go with Ethermint?
One of them was definitely overhead. So the migration process. So what would it take for them to actually redeploy their entire infrastructure, right? Because they have a lot of web apps, they've got a lot of contracts, a lot of developer tooling that, wouldn't be the greatest if you had to rewrite it all. That was definitely one of them. At the time, we were aware, obviously, that Substrate was planning an EVM module, which they've completed. But at the time, it wasn't complete. And basically, that meant that they couldn't, deploy smart contracts to Polkadot. So that was one of the biggest deterrents. The second was the ability to have dev tooling. Deploying your smart contracts because you have an EVM is one thing, right? But interacting with them is a whole nother issue. So if you already have existing infrastructure, one of the big ones for them was, how can I get like MetaMask or their existing CLI tools to interact seamlessly with the contracts that have been deployed? That was actually probably one of the more challenging pieces of the whole project, was creating a Web3 shim, so similar to the JSON RPC API that like MetaMask interacts with, or that Ethers.js uses, or Web3.js. We had to create a shim that basically made it look like Ethers and Web3.js were interacting with an actual Ethereum JSON RPC, but in the back we're actually doing a bunch of magic to kind of reformat a lot of the data and a lot of the incoming transactions so that your applications can still work. And that was definitely the most challenging part. And I think that's one of the big takeaways. That was one of the big bonuses for them, was that their infrastructure would work out of the box and they wouldn't have to rewrite anything.
And if you look at the Polkadot EVM thing, is that something that just doesn't exist yet, and at some point they'll also support that, or is there some sort of reason why that's not possible in Polkadot?
So it doesn't exist right now. Right now they only have the EVM as a runtime module, which is very similar to an SDK module from a comparison perspective. And I have been chatting with them, and they are looking at probably implementing it. I don't know what it looks like on their timeline, and because they are quite busy with a lot of other things. So they do have plans to integrate it. I don't know when. And I think you can interact with the smart contracts and stuff because their APIs are actually quite nice, probably more elegant than the JSON RPC API. But obviously, there's the inherent limitation of the existing tooling not being able to utilize it.
Yeah, it's kind of like a big point to be able to support the Web3 API, is because the Ethereum state and dev tooling was built specifically, the state transition function was used to go through the Web3 API. The Ethereum was meant to really interact with that kind of stuff through the RPC API. So without that, there isn't really much tooling to kind of facilitate the usage of just the state transition function without it. So for example, in Ethermint, the EVM module by itself is not really that easy to use right now, because all the dev tooling and how people are used to interacting with Ethereum is all through the RPC API, as I said. So it is kind of a big point to have that supported, or else transitioning would be quite difficult, and it would kind of defeat the purpose of kind of having the EVM state transition to transition from Solidity Ethereum smart contracts to any sort of other VM execution or anything. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it's worth mentioning. I don't know if you guys are aware of that history, but so there was a company originally called Eris Industries and later called Monex, and that I joined in 2015. Ethan Buckman was the first developer there, and they built back then their own implementation of the EVM on top of Tendermint as well, right? So that was back in 2015. That was always one of the big, and it was primarily used for kind of enterprise chains and banks and things, private chains. So there are no public chains running on top of that. Now it's a part of the Hyperledger thing. It's this project called Burrow in there. But that was always one of the big issues, was that none of the Ethereum RPC calls worked, right? So all of the dev tooling didn't work, and so that made it, I think, also hard to get adoption for it.
That's funny that you bring that up. I believe we had a look at Burrow to see if there was any tricks that are happening under the hood, and I believe Austin at one point just goes, "Oh, they're like looping a lot," and it looks like it's really inefficient.
Yeah, like I think they did start doing the like Web3 API either around the time that we did or maybe a little bit after. I can't remember the exact timeline, but yeah, they seem, the way they're doing some things just seem to have some bottlenecks. I didn't really look too much into it, and that was a bit ago, but yeah.
But yeah, this is something that Ethan also worked on a lot back in the day.
That's so funny.
Yeah.
He seems to have touched a little bit of everything.
Yeah. And curious, are you guys seeing a lot of interest from other projects that have similar plans like Aragon that have bottlenecks on Ethereum and are also looking at Ethermint?
Yeah, we've been contacted a fair amount for a multitude of things, people wanting to actually just deploy their existing infrastructure. So things that are let's call it like a public good, so to speak, that people use every day on Ethereum. So they're kind of waiting for more of like an Ethermint zone to pop up, as well as people looking at just running their own kind of Ethermint implementation. But there's a lot of interest. As soon as the Aragon made their announcement, within a matter of days, we were being contacted by quite a few people, and still to this day.
So let's say somebody built Ethermint zone. How do you think that will compare with Ethereum in terms of especially throughput? That's
a good question, and it comes down to ultimately a few factors, and I think Austin can speak on some of these as well. So one of the things to remember is like we're running Tendermint, so we're running POS here, which means if you're a part of the zone, you become a zone of like a Cosmos hub. I believe at that point you're really limited to ultimately what the hub can handle. And when you go on your own chain, you also need to go find your own validator sets too. But typically from what we've seen is you're sharing. We haven't done extensive tests on it, although I'm predicting it will be roughly the same if you use like the same set of features, the same config. I don't know, Austin, what do you think?
It'll really depend. It just depends, because I mean, if the zone is going to be verifying its transactions through the Cosmos hub, then there I guess would obviously be that bottleneck. Yeah. But if it's run as its own sovereign zone where it has its own validators and it's being verified only through the Ethermint zone, there still would be the obvious bottlenecks of which occurred from trying to fit this Ethereum state transition on top of Tendermint. It's just two systems that there will be some some bottlenecks with forcing some things to work. But yeah, it just depends how the chains are rolled out, because there is multiple different options.
Yeah, I mean, you can't really verify the EVM on top of the Cosmos hub, right? I think if you do an Ethermint zone, then it would be, I think, its own validator set.
The bottlenecks actually, that bit of a miscommunication. The bottlenecks within the networking, it's whether it's whether the Cosmos networking will be able to handle that much, right? So
the Cosmos networking, you mean like the whole relaying, gossip, and all of that stuff?
Yes.
So you think that would become the bottleneck?
I believe, yeah. We chatted with them a bit about that, and they think that's probably where like the biggest bottleneck is right now, one of the bigger ones. But we haven't done extensive testing to be comfortable saying any numbers on that.
So all I was going to say was just that it's really hard to predict throughput when at the stage that the project is at now, and it's not exactly at a point where it's production ready. I mean, everything works and you can interact with things how you want, but as far as like an actual simulated network, there hasn't been any testing in any sort of like actual environment with an actual validator set and a chain, a zone running on its own. So it's really hard to say like what the throughput would be.
Yeah. I mean, I won't pin you guys down too much. Maybe final. So, like, let's assume we have a chain like the Cosmos Hub with 100 validators. I'm still curious, like, just a sort of rough ballpark. Do you guys think that would kind of like match Ethereum or be, I don't know, 10x more throughput? Or like, can you give some? What would just be your guesses?
I would like to say you could for sure match. I don't want to comment on how much. I mean, in theory, on a private testnet that you run by yourself, you can make really the throughput however much you want it to be. It's a matter of like adjusting some parameters. But yeah, I don't know. Again, the reason I bring up networking is because in Ethereum, to actually go through a full state transition and whatnot takes like 3 to 5 seconds on average, and the rest of the 15 seconds is spent propagating blocks around the network, right? So that's where your inherent limitations are always going to end up being. Obviously, if you raise the gas limit and all that stuff, like the block gas limit, you can jam a lot more into it. But yeah,
right. But in Ethereum, I mean, they have to basically. They can't decrease the block time too much because otherwise they're going to have all these orphan blocks and, miners that are remote. So I think the proof of work economics make it hard to increase the block size. But that's different, in Tendermint, right? In Tendermint, you will be able to increase the block size more. And, like, for example, we are running a validator on Loom. Loom has, 25 validators across a block and 1 second block time. So I think you would be able to, you should definitely be able to verify, just in terms of the amount of data, much more than Ethereum, right? That you can like finalize and process and stuff. But I don't know if, for example, the EVM might become the bottleneck, right? Because you have to make all the state transition. If you can't do those close enough, maybe you can't keep up with it.
Yeah. There's definitely going to be a lot more testing that needs to go into that stuff. It's just not in scope right now. We want to finish everything up first make sure the RPC API is sound.
I mean, there's the one guaranteed point, which is if you are just having your own testnet or something where you're sending not a ton of transactions and like not flooding, the transactions obviously will process faster than Ethereum and be finalized instantly. So that's like the main point. But it's just like it's not certain what the bottleneck exactly will be. I mean, it'll obviously be a mix of the slight inefficiencies of porting over the EVM state transition, and it may just be like the Tendermint networking or something like that. I'm not exactly sure what the bottleneck would be, but it's very hard to like pinpoint, I guess, what the throughput would be at like a large scale.
Yeah. And what's the timeline on the Aragon Chain launch, or maybe Ethermint being sort of where you guys feel okay, it's ready to public chain to be launched through it?
I mean, at this point, Ethermint's, in our opinion, there's a few small like gotchas that we're cleaning up right now that have been identified, but we're definitely in a position where I think we're going to probably run a long-standing testnet pretty soon, within the next few weeks, to which, don't know how the zone's going to happen, but definitely want to get that out probably sometime in the new year. Definitely like once you have 30 to 60 days of like this long-standing testnet being bug-free, in my opinion, and we've kind of worked out the economics of like a more optimal and what's the most suitable configurations like we just talked about, that's probably when we'll go live. I think a lot of the work's going to just be trying to figure out what makes the most sense. And then in regards to Ethermint, we'll be releasing a specification shortly, kind of like on the migration process, how that's going to look, and what kind of we're building towards in the new year. And we're hoping to get a launch out, whether it be testnet or live, definitely in Q1. Probably in the later half of Q1, we'll get a live Aragon chain going.
Cool, fantastic. And do you guys plan to, what are your future plans here? Are you guys going to continue to sort of build and improve Ethermint? Are you guys also looking at other work to be done sort of in the Cosmos ecosystem?
Yeah, we're definitely going to continue to work on Ethermint, provide optimizations where we can find them. And yeah, we're, in regards to like just Cosmos in general, after working this extensively and going this deep, we've identified our own kind of issues within the SDK, and we've had to make a few PRs to that. So I think we're going to start kind of looking towards, how can we help improve the overall systems within the SDK modules.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I definitely want to myself personally continue, just because I obviously see a lot of value in Ethermint and of like the ability for people to kind of transition from their existing workflows over. So yeah, I mean, I've kind of invested a lot of time over the past couple of months getting really familiar with all these interactions, and I have some ideas of how it can be improved and made more stable. So it's definitely something that I want to continue with. It's just I'm not sure exactly what the scope of what's next is, because I feel like it's a lot defined by what they want to do as far as like the Ethermint zone and how they actually want to, it's pretty set out that they want to do the hard spoon, which is basically just like transitioning the current state of Ethereum onto like an Ethermint zone. Sorry. But it's not certain, and it's not finalized how they exactly want to roll it out. So I'm eager to see what happens with it and hopefully help out and build some more on top of it, and we'll see what happens.
Oh yeah, that's great that you bring that up. So I think that is an interesting topic. So for those who don't remember, which is probably most, there was originally a plan, I think this probably came up some point after the Cosmos fundraiser, I think it was after the Cosmos fundraiser, to basically launch this Ethermint zone, this Ethermint chain, to like fork the entire Ethereum distribution, and then the fork the Ethereum state, and then maybe also kind of like airdrop some new token to Ether holders. And I guess there was, I think, always different ideas for what the idea there was. I think some had the idea that maybe this could be like where you could continue running your Ethereum applications on top of that, or just as a way to basically sort of airdrop and distribute tokens. What do you think of the feasibility of that? Does it make sense to like take the entire Ethereum state, like put it on an Ethermint zone, and then say like, okay, you have some app on Ethereum and you can continue running it?
I think it makes a lot of sense in the context of providing a sandbox or something to test out Ethermint without actually having to go through the whole process of deploying everything again and seeing what happens. Like they have their existing state, they know how they're interacting with it right now. They can just basically test the same workflow or however on Ethermint, which is kind of like a good way to onboard, I guess, instead of having to because right now you would have to redeploy your contracts and then set up any necessary context or whatever. So it does provide a lot of benefit there. Yeah, I mean, I think the main reason they did it, I guess before, was to have like a separate token in the Cosmos ecosystem.
I think it was to showcase, really. I think it was just trying to showcase the power.
Because I remember they did want a more fluid token, so that was the...
Yeah, that was one of the... I mean, to be honest, I think there was different ideas, and there wasn't necessarily a sort of like coherent plan around it. But yeah, I agree. Like the idea of having a separate token was one idea. I think the idea was to showcase. It was certainly also an aspect to it.
So it's hard to know exactly what the plan is or what the current state of what they want the direction to be. Yeah, it would be cool. It definitely would be a lot of benefit for people transitioning over. Just make things. It definitely wouldn't be the most usable zone. I guess it depends how the past state is forked over. If it's if it's storing all the previous blocks again on Tendermint, it may be quite inefficient because you're storing a lot of data that isn't really. If you want to access it, you can't prune it, and it would just become incredibly bloated. But if it's just like forking over the current state as it is and not, keeping past history of all the previous, then it might be slightly more usable. But I feel like anyone wanting to use and like interact should probably not. It probably would be more efficient to just start fresh, because there isn't really a reliance on having all of the contracts and everything deployed together and using all of the existing state. So it just depends on like whatever, an application developer or whoever wants to design their zone or how they want to, interact with it.
Cool. Well, thanks so much for joining us today, guys. So I'll definitely link to, Chainsafe website and the report on Aragon and Ethermint. Is there anything else people should check out, or who what are you looking for? Who should get in touch with you?
Yeah, I mean, like, if you're a developer, feel free to check out our GitHub. We have so many repos that are just running with lots of issues, and we're pretty collaborative. You can also join our Discords, where you can, if you have any questions about any of our projects we're working on, and if you have any like business inquiries, just email info@chainsafe.io, and somebody will get back to you really quickly.
Yeah, so I guess as far as like if you actually want to test out these things and use them, there's kind of two repos to kind of test two different components. There's on Chainsafe, there's a repo called Ethermint deploy, which basically starts an Ethermint node and can deploy a contract to it and kind of test it out that way. You can use other dev tooling, like you can deploy a contract through Remix, you can deploy it through Truffle, anything like that. And then also, if you just want to test out the EVM module on its own without the dev tooling, which I don't really see how that's that useful for people right now, because there's not really tooling built out around it. There is a small repo called Etherminty that just basically has the EVM just as a module if you want to test out your own state transition functions in your own Cosmos module or anything like that, or just getting started with plugging in the EVM state transition on top of in any Cosmos application. But yeah, if anyone comes up with any issues or has any problem with any dev tooling or deploying contracts and something, there's a discrepancy, I'd love to work through any issue. And if just someone would open it up on the Ethermint, Chainsafe Ethermint repo, we'd be happy to help anyone migrate over or see any discrepancies with how they currently interact with Ethereum.
Yeah. That's a good point. The most up-to-date version of Ethermint is at the Chainsafe, is the Chainsafe fork.
Yeah, I'm sure we're gonna merge back at some point soon, but for now, it's yeah.
Cool. Well then, thanks so much, guys, and thanks for joining us.
Yeah, thanks so much for your time.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you for listening to the Chorus One podcast. Visit chorus.one for more information about our work. Don't forget to subscribe to the podcast to stay tuned on new episodes airing every Monday.